Marjorie had been lingering outside the nondescript metal door for nearly 2 hours, appearing to study the door and the faded signs above it. "The deli," it read, in dusty script. Her coat was wrapped as tightly around her as the fraying fabric allowed, but still the winter air dug through it. The cold was not enough, however, to drive her out of the elements and through the door. Once or twice she approached it, hands shaking as it neared the handle, only to draw back at the last second, as if the handle was a snake. It should have been easier to enter the door the longer she waited, but it seemed to only grow immeasurably more difficult. It did not help that in her entire time waiting, no one had entered or left the building. Had someone sallied up, opened the door, and safely entered into the cloud of inviting warmth, it may have lured her in. Similarly, the safe exit of any sort of a person would have given her the assurance that one could brave whatever lay beyond. But the road was empty, and the door sat unmoving. A particularly sharp gust of wind whistled down the abandoned alley, tugging at her coat and sending her tangled hair into a maelstrom. Her eyes watered at the cold, and she inched closer to the wall, hoping it would afford some protection. It was silly. She chided herself, spending all the time out in the elements. This was what had to be done. She was out of options, and her only hope lay beyond that door. Yet, Marjorie wondered if perhaps it would be better to be hopeless than pay whatever price this hope would cost. The street light flickered on overhead. Soon it would be dark, and then she would have to make a decision, or risk staying on the unsafe street at night. Being here in the middle of the day was dangerous enough. She would not be caught outside after dark. There was a final shove she needed to overcome her inertia. With a sudden resolve, she gripped the door handle. It flew open in her hands almost reflexively, for which she was glad. The metal was bitterly cold, seeming almost to burn her with its chill. Had the door not stood open, she would have again released it and likely vanished back to her home. Inside was a nondescript concrete hallway. A lonely yellow light filled the inside, leading to another door. This door was made of a dark wood and had a heavy brass knocker affixed to the middle. Marjorie's steps echoed in the concrete chamber, coming to a sudden stop when the metal door groaned to a loud close. The weak evening light was now gone, leaving her alone with only a single light bulb. She had not realized how comforting it was to have that little bit of the outside world with her. With the door closed, even the distant sounds of traffic were cut off. Panic wrapped its claws around her throat. She felt her chest tightening with its serpentine grip. Her heart thundered against her ribs. In that moment, instincts took over, and she reverted to her most primitive responses. Flee. The echoes of her steps were maddening flurry around her as she sprinted the 15 feet back to the metal door. Her hands scrambled for purchase on the handle, only to find nothing but smooth metal. No handle on this side. The thunder of thousands of years of evolution continued to push her towards flight, and her fingers clawed around the metal door frame, hoping to find some crevice to pry open the door. Only there was again nothing. In the dim light afforded by the bulb, she could not make out a single seam. It was almost as if the door had sealed as soon as she had entered. Her breath now came in ragged gasps that did little to help her or calm her. Instead, The world seemed to swim before her. A mocking door, concrete walls. It was almost as if the walls were inching closer, activated on some cruel timer to pin her forever. All that she could hear was the flood of blood pulsing through her veins, the rapid fluttering of her heart frantically trying to escape, and the jarring sound of air ripping from her lungs before being shoved back inside. The walls acted as an echo chamber, reflecting her own terrified symphony back at her. Deep breaths, she reminded herself, just like those nights spent in the closet. Deep breaths. She had to slow herself down if she was going to survive this. Slowing her breathing to a measured pace was akin to stopping a car with no brakes. She felt her lungs fight against the control, trying to maintain their breakneck pace despite her insistence. Over time, however, she won out. The breaths were shaky, but calm. Her heart took its cue to return to its typical state of frenzy. The walls returned to their assigned spaces and stopped their dizzying journey. Carefully, Marjorie ran her hands along the walls where the door stood, confirming that there was no seam that she could grip. It was a well-constructed door. There was not even a glimmer of dying afternoon light slipping through the bottom. If she could not back out now, she must go forward. The hallway was not long, but she felt like a member of a funeral procession as she somberly made her way towards the door. Up close, you could see twisting, abstract shapes carved all over the door. They meant nothing to her, but she felt her breath begin to hiccup again in her chest. Deep breaths, she repeated her only mantra. Her hand was shaking as she placed it on the brass knocker. Unlike the door handle, this one was pleasantly warm to the touch, inviting almost. With a groan of rusted metal, she lifted it and rapped it quickly against the door. 1, 2, 3. The door began to swing smoothly in its hinges after the third knock, opening onto a room filled with the murmur of quieted voices and whiffs of strange-smelling smoke. She stepped gingerly inside, feeling immediately out of place. There were tables and booths scattered around the room. Marjorie did her best not to make eye contact or even look at them, keeping her eyes trained to the worn wood floor. She heard a few snickers, saw a couple of hands point her out from their shadowy seats, even as large frames filled her periphery. She walked steadfastly towards the counter at the far end of the room. Everyone in the room recognized immediately how out of place she was. While they were each bedecked in protective charms and talismans, some hanging from their necks, others etched into the scar tissues of their bodies, all she had was the flimsy barrier of her coat, still pulled tightly around her against the now suffocating heat of the small room. She walked gingerly across the creaking floorboards, barely daring to breathe. They grinned and watched. Marjorie approached the counter and lifted her eyes to see the attendant slouched on a stool behind the domed glass structure. Halfway to his face, her eyes froze on the contents of the display case. She assumed the rotted lumps inside had once been some sort of meat, though they were now covered in flies and maggots. Pooled, congealed blood covered the bottom surface, even seeping out and down to the floor. She followed the trail to see the red-stained warped wood along the floorboards. Mouth agape and eyes wide, she was certain she saw a few eyeballs and fingers mixed in amongst the decay, but she tried to put it out of her mind. "Want to try a sample?" came the mockingly gravelly voice of the attendant as he pulled open the door to the case. Immediately, a wave of putrescence poured out and enveloped Marjorie. She did her best to escape it, stumbling backwards and tripping over a warped floorboard. There was a low chuckle from those gathered round her, growing more and more quickly into a round of bodily laughter. She gagged, her stomach trying to force up the breakfast and lunch she had not eaten. It burned her eyes, starting them watering again, her stomach having only been successful in ejecting a small amount of water she had nervously sipped at outside. Her lungs took to coughing, anything to get that stench out of her body. There was a sound of a lock snapping into place as the attendant continued to laugh. She studied him briefly from her place on the floor behind watery eyes. He was filthy, covered in a layer of grime that made it impossible to tell his age. A tangled mess of dirt and wispy hair sat atop his head, falling into his beady eyes as he rocked back and forth with laughter at her predicament. His hands, stained and cracked with muck, gripped the counter as long, yellow nails scraped across the glass in time to his chuckling. Marjorie did her best to pull herself together, rising from the floor and straightening her clothes as if that would restore her dignity. The smell had faded. Now only a slight whiff of decay rather than the malodorous assault. That, or her nose could no longer register the scent, having burned out the sense for good. She threw her head back, eyes meeting the dark, glassy eyes of the man behind the counter. "I'm here to speak with your owner," she said in what she hoped was a confident voice. It did not help that it trembled and broke as she spoke. But at her words, a begrudging silence spread through the room. The attendant snorted a thick, mucusy sound. For a moment, she was afraid he was preparing to spit on her. Instead, he jerked one dirty finger into a paper ticket dispenser. "Take a number, then." With that, the attention on her seemed to fade. The low grumble of conversation returned as she heard chairs scraping across the wood as the denizens returned to their intrigue. She walked over and gripped the dusty piece of paper delicately, as if afraid it might crumble to dust in her fingers. Perhaps this was another trick. Instead, the machine groaned and dispensed a tiny slip. Number 43. She looked around for some sign that told her where she was. She had not seen anyone enter or leave today, so perhaps the line was long. But there was no such indicator. "Excuse me," she cautiously questioned the attendant. "How do I know what number is up?" One eye turned to face her. The other stared out over the bar. "Take a seat and you'll be called." His eyes flicked back to whatever was between the counter and the door that so raptly held his attention. Marjorie gingerly picked her way over to a unoccupied table, acutely aware that her back was exposed to whatever kind of people like to congregate in a place like this. She was certain that she could feel each individual eye raking over her back, spider-like appendages tracing up and down her spine. Her hands were balled into knots, resting bloodlessly on her lap. The minutes trickled by, marked only by the rise and fall of bawdy laughter. Marjorie kept her eyes focused on the table in front of her, trying to pick out the patterns and shapes in the wooden surface, trying to keep her mind from wandering too far from the task at hand. Somehow she knew she could snap if forced to take in the reality of where she was and what she was doing. Instead, she focused on the next step, meeting the owner and making her request. The crack of the metal mug slamming onto the wooden table brought her eyes up, open wide like an animal caught in a snare. A woman stood across from her, tall and broad-shouldered. She had one bright green eye that studied Marjorie up and down. In place of her other eye was a nasty incision, weeping a slight bit of pus that bulged with dark stitches. Without being invited, the woman settled into the seat across from Marjorie. "Me oh my, you don't belong here, pretty thing," she said in a hushed tone. Her eye was hungry. Marjorie sat silent as the woman studied her with a slight smile on her dry, swollen lips. "No, you aren't meant to be here at all. What brings a little bird like you to a place like this?" Marjorie focused her eyes back on the table. There was nothing she could say that would keep her safe, and she knew that. She needed to meet with the owner and make her request. "A quiet one. Not going to sing for Lucy, eh? Come on, tell me what you need, and I can help you get out of this place." Marjorie's silence prevailed. "We both know this is not a safe place for the likes of you. I've got a soft spot for women, knowing how hard it is to be among this rabble myself. Just let me help you, dearie." Almost unbidden, Marjorie's eyes lifted from the table and met with the woman's unnatural green one. It was beautiful, truly, even if it was nested with a hideous face. The green reminded Marjorie of a view from her bedroom window as a child on Easter morning. There was a small tree that grew just outside that always seemed to be absolutely covered in new leaves and shone with that bright spring green. That was the color of the eye, and it shone and sparkled like sunlight reflecting off water. "There now, I'm sure we can work something out. I just know I can help you with whatever you need." Lucy's voice was a soft sing-song, not the harsh growl of a dedicated chain smoker like before. "I'll even make sure my prices are fair, especially for a fair young thing like yourself." Marjorie felt a hand on her knee, gently stroking. "Them pretty eyes of yours, they look like they've seen a world of heartache, eh? I could take care of those for you. You'd like that, yes?" Eyes fixated, Marjorie felt her head begin to bob slightly. To not see the horrors she had in her time, well, that would be nice. "I see you like the idea." Lucy's face cracked open with a wide grin. "I thought you might. I'm good at seeing what people really need from me. I just need you to say it. Say you'll give me those awful eyes of yours, and I'll make sure you never see something so terrible again." Marjorie's mouth opened, the very words on her lips, when a strong hand settled onto her shoulder. It smelled of leather and blood and gripped her shoulder hard enough to break the trance. "Not gonna let you have all the fun, old Lucy. It's not every day we get something so lovely in this dingy place." Marjorie felt dizzy and confused, as if time were moving double again its normal pace. Her mind was slow in catching up to what was happening, what had almost happened, leaving her feeling as if she were lagging behind the rest of the world. Now Lucy was standing, measuring up to a formidable height, with anger in that lone green eye. "I'll not have you meddling, Thomas. She and I were nearly to a deal." "A deal you tricked her into, no less. Where's the fun in that? Just weave your little spell and she'll do whatever you want." "You've gone soft, Lucy. I need to make you work for it." His voice was soft but firm. It seemed to cut through the background din like a razor until it was the only thing she could hear. As Marjorie's mind caught up with what had just nearly happened, she felt her heart begin to race, And then there was a hand on her shoulder, the firm grip beginning to hurt with its intensity. The man bent over her shoulder, smiling, a long black beard tickling against the skin of her neck, and she could smell the whiskey on his breath. "I'm afraid we haven't been introduced, and I've already gone to save your life." "It's a bad habit, I admit. My name is Thomas." He extended his other hand towards her, the one on her shoulder growing tighter as she refused to shake. "Oh, we must be polite in an uncivil place as this, yes? What's your name?" Marjorie whispered at the pain in her shoulder, but fixed her eyes back on the table. She had to talk to the owner. She had to make her request. "Back off and let her be, Thomas. I saw her first. I made the first move." "There'll be others for you," barked Lucy's voice. "Yes, but you didn't close on the sale. Now did you?" His eyes flicked away from Marjorie for a moment, fixing on Lucy with a cold gaze before returning with more warmth to Marjorie's face. "You'll find that I'm much more direct. No need for silly games." The hand moved smoothly from her shoulder along the back of her neck. Suddenly his fingers were wrapped through her hair, yanking her head back, exposing her throat. She felt something cold and sharp there, and barely dared to breathe. His smiling face leaned over. "How many years would you give me to keep this pretty little neck of yours attached?" Marjorie heard a short laugh to her right, saw a slender man standing to the side. He stood just within her periphery, far enough back that she could only make out the vague shape of him. "Thomas, be careful. There's plenty of her to go around if we just act with a little tact. I bet you could make some even better deals if you thought this through." "Oh no, you aren't going to trip me up on that again. You swindled me out of everything last time." "You're right. It was a bit of a dirty trick. But surely you and Lucy could work out some sort of a deal. You don't need her eyes after all." Marjorie noticed the shadow of Lucy appear to turn and nod towards the man to the side. She heard a very soft chuckle from him. Thomas's hands gripped her hair even more tightly. "You're just mad that I got to her first. And this time, I'm cutting you out." "Well, fine. But I fear it's not just me you're going to be fighting against, Tom. A lot of us want a piece of her." Thomas leaned down by her ear, his words coming in a whispered frenzy. "Well, dear, looks like they'll be taking you piece by piece. What do you say then? Give old Tom whatever years you got left? At least they'll go to some sort of use, yeah?" Marjorie heard grumbling in the room, the sound of chairs scraping along the wood, a chorus of various metals greeting the metal. There was a new tension in the uncomfortably warm room, a weight that pressed down all around her. "Come on, time's ticking. Do we have a deal? You look like an altruistic soul. Help me out." Footsteps coming close, a few short barks of anger. The intensity increased in his voice, and he shook her head sharply. "They'll cut out your tongue soon, so you best tell me now." Marjorie felt tears falling down her cheeks, a steady stream now pouring from her eyes. She had to speak to the owner. She had to make her request. Only she was not sure she'd even get a chance. Someone grabbed Thomas, and the knife nicked her, drawing a thin line of blood far less lethal than it could have been. Marjorie dove under the table, trying to evade the arms that grabbed her. There was a smell of blood in the room, and all the inhabitants had been subtly whipped in a frenzy. She was the lone fish drifting amongst sharks. A mug struck her temple, Thick hands gripped and tugged her arms, leaving angry red bruises that began to darken almost instantly. The rough floor scraped along her knees and arms as she crawled, filling her skin with tiny needling splinters as she scrambled, kicked, and bit any appendage that came her way. She noticed the tempo of the fray beginning to increase. No longer was she the main prize, but the fighters had turned to one another, vying for the chance to claim this lovely reward. They knew, of course, that she had nowhere to run. Finally, she found a corner to hide in, burying her head in her arms and trying to drown out the sound of chaos around her. She needed to speak to the owner. After what felt like hours of combat, the sounds of an opening door cut through the din. A sudden silence filled the room, minus the groaning of the incapacitated, and Marjorie began to sob. This was it. The victor had been named, and she was now the trophy to be parceled as he or she saw fit. She could not even lift her eyes to see which of the horrors in the room she would be left with. However, something else broke the silence. "Number 43?" asked the calm voice of a young girl. Marjorie dared to barely lift her head, seeing the tiny figure standing in the doorway that had not existed moments before. "Number 43? She scrambled to her feet, holding aloft the ticket she had somehow held onto during the fray. None of the remaining combatants, the war obviously had not been won quite yet, dared to touch her as she walked forward towards the child in the doorway. Still, she shuddered and spooked as they milled about in the shadows. The girl motioned into the bright rectangle cut into the formerly intact wall, and Marjorie walked forward. The door closed behind her, a parlor trick she was now used to. It took a few moments for her eyes to adjust from the gloom of the waiting room to the warm light of this new area. It was a well-furnished office, completed with a large wooden desk and assortment of alluring leather chairs. The scent of cedar mixed with the smell of a crackling fireplace in a way that reminded Marjorie of weekend trips to her granddad's cabin. Silently, the young girl stepped against the wall behind Marjorie, next to what had been the doorway, but now was nothing more than another section of oak paneling. The man behind the desk did not look up at first. He was busy tallying and writing in a thick ledger, seemingly uninterested in the bruised and bloody woman before him. After a few moments, he looked up with a friendly smile and closed the book firmly. "Marjorie, pleasure to finally meet you. I see you got the traditional welcome from our guests. And not one of them was able to make a deal with you. You must be made of some tough stuff." She nodded mutely, uncertain of how to proceed. He simply smiled at her and gave her the time she needed to study him. His teeth were bright white, the only clean thing she had seen since entering the hall. His eyes were as dark as his teeth were white, but they appeared to be friendly. He waited for her to speak. He knitted his fingers together in front of him, rolling his shoulders to straighten out the drape of his crisp suit coat. Every bit of him seemed to be polished and neat, a stark contrast to the room before. Are you the devil?" She finally managed to speak out, eyes wide. He laughed, throwing his head back and letting the sound ripple around the room. It was a friendly, amused sound that put her at ease. "Oh no, nothing so boring as that. But you can give people whatever they want." He composed himself, that same broad smile still on his face. "Well, of course I can. But there is much more to this world than your simple understanding of gods and devils. Don't worry, Marjorie. This is no deal with the devil. But do tell me, what is it that you want? I came here to... The words could not come. She had thought and thought about how she would tell her story, how she would describe the years of abuse, threats, and evil. She considered taking off her coat and showing him the pale yellow stains of old bruises, but they were marred by fresh ones from the fray. She felt for the death certificate in her pocket, the name of her first son written on it, and now the words could not come out. She watched patiently, no hint of irritation at her pause. When she began to sob, he offered her a handkerchief from his pocket. He told everyone I was drunk. That was how I... He told everyone I was drunk. That was how I fell down the stairs. That was why Mikey died. The tears were coming down more earnest now, and she dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. They all looked at me like a terrible mother. That I couldn't be drinking while pregnant. They blamed me. If I had been sober, I wouldn't have fallen, and Mikey would have at least had a chance. No one believed me. I don't bring people back from the dead, Marjorie. Even I don't meddle in things like that. His voice was soft, almost as if moved by her tearful story. She took a moment to compose herself, sniffing and wiping away her tears. I know. That's not why I'm here. I want you to kill my husband. The words were out, blunt and dirty. Therefore, before she realized what she was saying, this was not how the discussion was supposed to have gone. His face brightened. Oh, is that all you need? Well, that should be a relatively easy matter. You don't understand. He's a monster. It won't be easy to kill him. You have to kill him because he's a very bad person. Marjorie, I don't care who he is. He could be Hitler or the Pope reincarnate. All I care about is that you want him dead, and I can make that happen, no matter how monstrous he might be. He reached over and pulled out an ornate ink pen from his desk. I will need some details like his name, address, distinguishing physical features. Also, would you like proof of his death? Marjorie's stomach churned at the thought of what she was doing. It was the only way, though. He had to pay for his crimes, and no one else was willing to do it. No, I won't need that. Everyone says you follow through with your deals. Word of mouth is certainly the best advertisement for services such as mine. He smiled that disarming smile again. Well, his name is David Birkin, and his address is 1394 Windhaven Road, apartment 1722. It's in Topeka. He continued writing and nodding. He's about 6 foot tall, a big bulky guy, blonde hair, brown eyes. He has some sort of tribal tattoo on the back of his neck and one of a skull on his right bicep. Is that enough? Oh, that's lovely. A wonderful description. I'll dispatch someone right away, he said, nodding to the small girl. Marjorie heard the door swinging open behind her, then closed quietly. But now that your terms are set, Let us discuss what I shall get in return. A few rules. I don't trade in souls. It is simply too much of a hassle to deal with. And the return is rather poor. I also don't accept firstborn children. At this, he nodded his head towards the spot the girl had been a moment before. I've done it once, but I found children not particularly useful. There was a sudden cruel glint to his smile. Besides, someone has already taken yours. Marjorie was silent, her fingers whirring over the hem of her jacket as if it would provide some sort of solace in this moment. Her heart was pounding again, and she wondered if perhaps she was going to suffocate here in this office. The scents and furnishing that had seemed to lavish now felt oppressive. But I can give you anything else, right? He paused to consider her comments. I reserve the right to refuse any substandard trade. I won't, for instance, take your pocket lint. He chuckled appreciatively at his own joke. But I accept most fair trades. His demeanor turned more serious, perhaps even taking on a sinister air. He leaned forward over the desk, shadows growing across his face as he did so. Think carefully now about what you'll give me for this. Whatever you decide, you will think it is something you will never want back, no matter how long you live. But once it's gone, you'll find you cannot live without it. You'll yearn for it. You'll do anything to replace it. You'll take it. But it will never be enough. You'll always be shrouded in the filth of something borrowed. So make a wise choice, but know there is no wisdom that will save you. What will you give me? She thought long and hard, and she had spent days thinking about it already. She was almost certain she had thought of something that in no way could harm her, no matter what, in fact. She reminded herself. It would be a relief. She would be strong and brave then, not the timid girl that had entered. My pain, she finally answered. He smiled eagerly, a response that made her suddenly uncertain. Oh yes, we have a deal. Pain is one of my favorites, and don't come back here saying I didn't warn you. With that, he clamped her hand in his and shook it once. Marjorie felt his grip began as an excruciating vice, then dwindled until she could barely even notice it. The aches and pains of her various cuts and bruises almost dimmed before disappearing altogether. As promised, with it gone, she also felt that absence acutely. It was a kind of nostalgia now, a prickling sense of something missing, a longing to return. This wasn't so bad, she thought, uncomfortably certain, but it must have been the right choice. He still smiled. You think it's going to be that easy, but that's just the first taste. Give it time. But there was a crackle in her voice. Sacrificing pain did not remove fear. I can take away others' pain now, right? His eyes simmered with glee, as if her altruism was a delicious appetizer. Of course, my dear, and you most certainly will, again and again. You'll valiantly step in and take away every ache from their bodies, dry the tears from their eyes, and someday that won't even be enough. You'll hunger for more, so you'll give them a little pain, only to take it away, until that isn't enough either. I told you, it will never be enough. You can try to drown yourself in pain and agony of millions and never be satisfied. His grin finally split into a restrained laughter, and he quickly reassembled his face into a look of mild amusement. His excitement glimmered in his eyes. Lost in his eyes, in the long future stretching before her, in half-perceived glimpse of a monster she would become, Marjorie barely noticed, as the room faded from around her, the last thing to disappear were her eyes. And she blinked. She felt dazed, as if waking from a dream, as she stood the sidewalk, and in the light of the early dawn, impossibly, she was standing in front a nondescript brick building on the other side of town. "Remember," she heard his voice in the breeze, "the deli is always open. I'm guessing you'll have a table all your own soon enough."